Hi, Amanda. Welcome, Miami alumni and friends. I'm Brian Marshall, Chair of the Department of Political Science. This is our fifth webinar on the 2024 elections to celebrate the department's 100th year anniversary. So we'll be talking with Amanda Seitz in just a minute on sorting through the spin, misinformation in the 2024 election. But for just a minute, as some of you may know, we're trying to endow the Political Science Centennial Fund. The Centennial Fund will provide scholarships for our students in terms of transformative experiences like internships, fellowships with alums, study abroad and study away programs that they take a lot of interest in. As some of you know, I think student need has grown significantly here at Miami University. But I do see an impact on our students almost every day from programs and support that our alumni give back to our students. So please do consider giving to the Political Science Centennial Fund, and you can do that from the Political Science Centennial webpage. So if you go to Miami University's webpage to the Department of Political Science, in the quick links, you'll see the Political Science Centennial page. And on that Centennial page, you can see the impact that your giving has on our political science students, from videos that they do study abroad, from videos on study away, from conferences, from so many different things, different ways that our alums have an impact on our students. So please go to that site and consider the Political Science Centennial Fund. Now, I'm excited to have Amanda Seitz join us. She's one of our wonderful alums from 2012. And Amanda has been a reporter with the Associated Press for over 6 years now, covering a variety of policy areas, including most recently healthcare and some of the the impact the Supreme Court decisions have had on healthcare policy, as well as areas like misinformation in politics, the spread of information, and how it impacts us in terms of how we participate in our democracy. Beyond that, Amanda's had several years' experience as a reporter in the Cincinnati area, but also in Wisconsin as well. So she's a very seasoned, astute reporter, and it's just an honor to have her here talk with us today about misinformation in the 2024 election. Amanda, it's yours.
Me, and thank you for everyone who's joined. I was actually chatting back and forth with my former professor Chris Kelly as those arguments were going on last week. So it's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm so grateful for all of the knowledge that I gained through the political science department. So I covered misinformation for the Associated Press from 2018 through 2022 so through 2 midterm elections, a presidential election, a pandemic, and a not so peaceful transfer of power as well. So I want to give you kind of an overview of misinformation and where we might be headed in this election year. So first, I want to start with a little bit of a plug for my employer, the Associated Press. For those of you who don't know, we are a global news outlet with 250 locations in nearly 100 countries. So on any given day, I work with editors in London, reporters in Montana, really all throughout the world. We produce 2,000 stories per day, 1 million photos per year, and we've been recognized 56 times with Pulitzer Prizes, which is journalism's highest honor. Over half the world sees something from the AP, whether it be a photo or here's a news report every day from the AP. So I want to start by going over 2 of the most important terms that we're going to use today. The first is misinformation and what it means. Really, misinformation covers a lot of what we're going to discuss today. It's false information that's shared about a particular topic. So that could range from anything like an honest mistake, a misreading of documents, exaggerations from a politician about their accomplishments, a misunderstanding of the facts, and even conspiracy theories. Usually, misinformation is not necessarily spread with malicious intent. So it could be like your relative when they share a Facebook status that says something like, if you don't copy and paste this Facebook status by midnight tonight, Mark Zuckerberg's going to delete all your Facebook photos. Your relative doesn't mean to share that because they're trying to spread misinformation. In fact, they're trying to be helpful to you, but they just got caught up with some bad information. Disinformation, on the other hand, it's created intentionally to mislead people, to spread false information or confuse people. And then it's spread very intentionally as well. We rarely refer to something as disinformation just because it's very difficult to prove the intent behind misinformation. But one of the most obvious recent examples was the Ukraine war. We saw Russia very intentionally deny what they were doing in Ukraine. They were actively dropping bombs, invading the country, and then turning around on their state media channels, on official accounts, claiming that they weren't doing this. The image of this woman, for example, she was one of the victims in the Mariupol maternity ward hospital bombing. And we saw Russian state media, Russian affiliated social media accounts claim that she was a crisis actor. We saw that a lot in the early days of the Ukraine war. So that's very clearly disinformation. It's something that has been, these falsehoods have been created with a clear intent to mislead. In this case, Russia was trying to mislead citizens in its own country by claiming that it wasn't starting a war, as well as people around the world. They were trying to claim that they weren't starting a war. So that was clearly disinformation. I want to go over next the common types of misinformation that we see. Obviously, today we're mostly focused on political misinformation. And that can range really from anything from a politician that might misspeak in their speech. They might exaggerate their accomplishments. They might launch a campaign ad that makes misleading claims about what their political opponent might have done in their past. And it also could cover false claims around ballot issues, for example. And then we also see other folks on social media that are spreading false claims about candidates or political campaigns. That's most commonly what we're looking at. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a huge spike in health-related misinformation. A large part of that was driven because by the fact that we didn't know what was going on with how COVID was spreading, how dangerous it was, how it might be treated. So we saw a huge rise in false claims around everything from how COVID-19 might be cured to the vaccines that were being developed around COVID-19. And just generally speaking, we see a lot of misinformation around medical treatments and supplements, mostly from people who are trying to make money off of you by making false claims about what their product might do. We're also dealing with a huge rise in technology-driven misinformation. So that might include an edited photo or a manipulated video. It might include audio that's been tampered with in order to make someone say something on the audio that they didn't actually say. And then we also address a lot of geopolitical misinformation. So that could refer to the reference I made earlier about Russia and some of the narratives that they were putting out and disinformation that they were putting out in the Ukraine war. It could be foreign countries that put out statements or social media posts about their human rights violations. So we see a lot of foreign countries trying to mislead, again, their own citizens about what they're doing, and then people outside of the country as well, trying to influence their opinion about the country or what actions that country is taking. And then I kind of call this our bread and butter misinformation, the conspiracy theories that have been around now seemingly forever. So there have always been conspiracy theories about the moon landing, JFK's assassination. Those are the type of conspiracy theories that we've dealt with for a long time. And then anytime there's breaking news of any sort, we see a rise in misinformation. So something that comes to mind is mass shootings. For example, we always see claims about the perpetrator, for example, or the suspect's motives, or even who the suspect was. We might see false photos around the person. We're really always watching for misinformation around any breaking news event or any topic of the day. Next, I want to go over some of the motives for spreading misinformation. The first is really some people are just trying to inform their family members and friends, and they come across a social media post that might resonate with them, might confirm their beliefs, and they want to share it. And they're not trying to spread falsehoods in any way, they're not trying to spread inaccuracies, but they end up doing so inadvertently. And that's probably a lot of what many of you have come across just in your day-to-day life is someone posts a picture or an Instagram story. They repost it from another page and it has some misinformation in it. The second, as I mentioned earlier, is money is often a motive for spreading misinformation. People making false claims about their products, again, particularly health products. We see that a lot. In the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, we found a group of individuals that was claiming that they had developed a 2-minute rapid COVID test. This set off kind of some bells and whistles for us because the president at the time, President Trump, had just announced the rollout of a 5-minute COVID test, and these people were claiming they had developed a 2-minute COVID test the next day. We saw high-ranking people tweet out this claim that this 2-minute COVID test had been developed. We saw senators tweet out the information, for example, and it wasn't an actual test. It was never developed. These people were just trying to make money off of a product that didn't even exist. And then most obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we see people who are spreading misinformation to really influence how you vote, how you think of a politician, how you think of an event in order to influence maybe your thoughts on a political event. So that's a really big motive for a lot of folks in the misinformation space. And then lastly, I'll mention that misinformation is often the result of some poor journalism. We've seen a really big rise in kind of citizen journalists or outlets that are actually politically affiliated but claim to be a news outlet, a local news outlet, and they're not trained journalists, and they make mistakes sometimes, or they might, sometimes they want to spin a story in a certain way and they insert errors in the story or information that's not accurate. So you may be wondering why you're hearing so much about misinformation now. Again, as I referenced earlier, falsehoods have always existed. They've always circulated. Conspiracy theories have been around for a very long time around things like the moon landing or JFK's assassination. But the reason misinformation has become such a problem now is really the rise of the internet. People can send out a tweet or make a Facebook post, and they can rack up thousands and thousands of views by making a false claim just with the click of a button. And these false claims can travel because of the internet really around the world in a matter of seconds. The internet's also created these echo chambers and kind of silos where the more you click on a falsehood, the more you're going to see of it in your feed because of how social media algorithms work and how Google algorithms work. So once you click on one wrong thing or one post that has a ton of inaccuracies in it, you're going to be shown more of that. So it really drives you down into these rabbit holes where maybe all you're seeing all day long is misinformation. The other reason that we're hearing so much about misinformation is just a fracturing of the media ecosystem. So we've seen a huge decline of traditional news sources like local newspapers. It's no secret that they've been kind of gutting their newsrooms. Some have been closing altogether. And in that void, we've seen an increase in kind of these bad actors that take their place. So that might be, again, so a TikTok kind of journalist that is reporting the news, but might not actually have been where the news occurred or really have any inside knowledge that they're claiming. It could be partisan news sources that are filling this void that really have a motive to report on certain things in a certain way. And then personalities too, that have kind of taken over this role of traditional journalism. And then our political leaders, we're seeing them push out falsehoods more frequently. And there hasn't been a lot of repercussion for when they do that. And lastly, there's been a significant decline in trust in major institutions. People are turning to some of these alternative sources as that trust in institutions declines. So what have we seen in most recent elections? 2016 was really the election where people started to take notice of how misinformation was influencing the vote. We saw this rise in social media posts that were riddled with inaccuracies. And at the time, we didn't see a lot of response from news outlets, for example, to some of those falsehoods. I know when I was working in newsrooms in 2016, there was a thought that we'll just ignore some of these posts that have really bad information about political candidates or the elections in them because we don't want to help spread some of these falsehoods. Tech companies also weren't really regulating this or moderating this type of content in any way. So, you had the real life election playing out, and then behind the scenes, you had people that were consuming a lot of misinformation, and it might have influenced how they voted. We also saw some of our foreign adversaries start to interfere in the election in this manner. So they would, Russia, for example, would start to echo some of the misinformation by creating fake accounts that shared posts with misinformation about US political candidates in them. In 2020, we continued to see kind of more of the same, and some of these political divisions deepen online. We saw more misinformation. We saw new foreign adversaries like China start to join in and echoing some of that misinformation that I mentioned earlier. But more importantly, we saw more US political operatives also join in on the misinformation game. So you saw PACs starting Instagram accounts where they would post a lot of content around candidates or the news of the day that weren't really accurate. You saw them, we've seen a lot of political operatives launch local news sites, as I mentioned. On either side of the aisle, we have Democratic-backed PACs doing that and Republican-backed PACs doing that sort of thing. And then we had a pandemic going on, which, as I mentioned, only deepened the mistrust that was already going on in some of those major institutions, because there was a lot of question about how this pandemic started, about the government's response to it. So that was going on in the background and, again, deepening some of this mistrust that was playing out. We did see tech companies, though, and news outlets start to respond to this misinformation by fact checking it, for example, or looking at some of the social media posts that were going around, especially ones that were particularly popular, and putting out fact checks around that. You saw social media companies start to suppress some of the major conspiracy theories that were going on. So we really saw this a reaction to some of this misinformation in a way that we didn't previously see in the election. But overall, misinformation really became part of our daily life in 2020, again, between pandemic, COVID-19 misinformation, and the election. It was a big part of our everyday. And then we saw 2020 capped with a claim that the election results were actually rigged in some way, or that the results were wrong. And that obviously resulted in the January 6th incident. So what do we expect to see as we head into 2024? I think we're going to see a lot of the same of what we saw in 2020, in part because we have two of the same candidates running for office again. We'll see former President Donald Trump continue to make claims about the election being stolen. He brings that up in his speech. One interesting thing that we've seen on the Biden side of things is that he's starting to kind of poke fun at conspiracy theories around him. So this picture that I have here, most recently, his campaign tweeted out as a response to the Kansas City Chiefs winning the Super Bowl. One of the conspiracy theories that was going around was that the Super Bowl would be rigged in the Kansas City Chiefs' favor because of Travis Kelce and his relationship with Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift had previously endorsed Joe Biden, so there were conspiracy theories going around that the game was rigged in their favor to give Taylor Swift and ultimately Joe Biden more attention ahead of this upcoming election. So we saw him tweet out this photo as kind of a nod to that conspiracy theory as a joke. So I think that's kind of an interesting shift we've seen headed into the 2024 election, is just kind of this embrace of conspiracy theories by poking fun of it almost. Unfortunately, I think we'll see continue to see more threats against elected officials, election workers, and politicians based on falsehoods that have been spread about the accuracy of the vote count. We saw that really play out in 2020, people making false claims about ballots and what election workers had done. We saw a number of death threats against election workers themselves. I only think that's going to worsen, unfortunately. We're also dealing with a rise in artificial intelligence and how it's being used in misinformation. So most recently, we saw some faked robocalls that were sent out ahead of the New Hampshire primary that imitated Joe Biden's voice. They were fake. But those were going around. I think we're going to see more of that headed into this election. It'll be difficult to moderate because things like photos, videos, and audio, you can't really search for them online. You have to come across them. There's no text search that you can look for. So that'll be difficult to really rein in. I think we're also going to see a rise in foreign, quote unquote, influencers. So we reported in 2022 that China was using these pages of young women that were posting really beautiful pictures of themselves throughout China, maybe tourism destinations, for example. And they would sometimes sprinkle in these like very subtle political commentary in their posts. I think we'll see an increase in that. So one of the things that we saw these Chinese influencers post about was how the US had pulled out of Afghanistan. I think we'll continue to see that sort of subtle messaging from some of our foreign adversaries in this upcoming election, depending, I don't know that they will necessarily, swing one way or another. They'll just try to, inject some of this confusion, some messaging into the conversation. Again, I think we'll see an increase in these news sites that are actually bankrolled by political operatives and have a significant slant in their coverage. And then the other really notable thing that we've seen headed into 2024 that's of concern is we've seen all the tech companies really pull back significantly on their moderation of misinformation and conspiracy theories. So that was one thing we saw in 2020, was that they really tried to downplay content that included known conspiracy theories in them, known misinformation in them. The tech companies have really gotten some pushback on that, and they have pulled back. So I don't think that we'll see a lot of moderation from them in this coming election. So to cap off, I'd like to go over a few ways that you can protect yourself from misinformation, because there's no doubt that you will inherently come across it as the 2024 election is underway. The first thing I like to suggest is when you see it come across an account or a website ask yourself why someone might be sharing that information. What motives might they have? And you can do this in a number of ways. You can maybe, one of the first things that I do, for example, I have 2 young children at home. So I get a lot of content around parenting advice. And one of the things I always like to do is just take a look at what kind of hashtags a person might be using when they post, because it might give me some insight as to what topics they like to post about, or what topics they're trying to catch people's attention with. So it just kind of gives me a little idea of, okay, why is this person posting this thing? And then I might go check out their profile account and look at how old the profile is, maybe what previous things they've posted, what does their account description tell me, anything like that. So just be looking on the lookout, especially now that we're seeing so many social media companies suggest content in your feeds. And then if you're looking at a website, look for basic information that reputable news websites always have. So they should have an author or a byline on a story, for example. They should have contact information. Is there a way to reach like an editor, or to ask for a correction on a story? Those are all things that reputable news outlets will do. They should also have a description of their standards or the type of work that they produce as well. If you're having trouble finding those things on a website that claims it covers the news, it's probably a red flag. And lastly, this is a really easy tip that's been so helpful. You can Google image reverse search anything. So if you come across a photo that looks questionable, especially in a photo that's in a breaking news situation, all you have to do is, if you're on your computer, right click on that photo and you can do a Google image search. It'll show you if that image has been previously circulating on the internet. So let's say someone claims that there's a photo from the war in Gaza, for example. If you come across that photo, you could right click on it, do a Google image reverse search, and then you might find that it had actually been circulating back in 2016 on the internet. So it's probably not a recent representation of what happened. You can also do this on your phone as well. Just hover over the image, press down on it, and you'll be able to do a Google reverse image search. So in conclusion, there's going to be a lot of misinformation in this election, unfortunately. As I mentioned, it's part of our daily life now, really. And I'm really looking forward to your questions.
That's so incredibly informative and interesting as we're going into the 2024 election, Amanda. Thank you so much. We do have a number of questions that we have from viewers out there, and I want to remind viewers they can put in the chat questions if they want to do that. The first one we have from Christopher: what should be the standards of accountability or gatekeeping on social media platforms? So in other words, you talked about this a little bit. The trend is for these organizations to do less of that in 2024. But can we hold them to any kinds of standards or accountability?
Well, I think that's such an interesting question, because I think ultimately that idea has been sort of rejected in all honesty. There was a really big push after the 2016 election when people realized they had been duped by fake accounts with misinformation, for social media companies to moderate their platforms more. But ultimately, we saw a lot of pushback when they did start to moderate their content and when they placed fact checks over content. That was something that the public largely was upset about. You saw politicians even float the idea that they should be forced to moderate this content, and that just didn't bode well. So, there is definitely thought out there that they should be moderating this content, but it just has not been a popular idea that has really materialized.
Interesting. So from your perspective, though, thinking about the media reporting, like what's the gold standard for your industry?
Just when we're reporting a story, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think one of the things that you should look for to make sure that an article is meeting that gold standard are there a variety of sources in the article, right? Was the reporter on the scene, for example, of the thing that they're reporting about, if it's a breaking news event? So, I try to seek out, at minimum, when I report a story, usually 3 to 4 sources. If you're reading an article and you don't see a lot of quotes in there, it's a lot of opinion, that's going to be a red flag.
Okay. Well, that's very helpful. So let's see. We do have a number of other questions as well. Some of these questions from our viewers, Amanda, are dealing more with strategies on dealing with misinformation. For example, we have Mary Ann ask the question. So she says, I've felt for months that we need someone at the national level who responds to misinformation. Do you think there is a mechanism that could be used for that?
Yes. Well, the Associated Press actually developed a whole fact-checking team in response to the 2016 election. So at one point, there was a team of us we were fact-checking posts on social media that were circulating widely, and looking at whether those were true or not, consulting with people around the world about different things that were trending. We also regularly fact-checked politicians. We've decided, headed into this 2024 election, to take more of a different approach, to not separate out these fact checks, to really try to fact check misinformation directly in the story. So let's say a politician says, the sky is green. Maybe we put that in the story and then explain that that's not the case, and here's where we got that from. So we're trying to really embed that content in, or that fact checking into our content, because we found that people generally get turned off sometimes by the word fact check. They feel like someone's talking at them instead of telling them why something's wrong. So that's an approach that we've taken. And then you also see a lot of other news outlets, national news outlets, that have news verification teams, fact-checking teams that are out there looking at, again, any social media posts that are popping up in response to breaking news or false claims being made about politicians, or from politicians, excuse me.
Yeah, and that actually answers, I think, one question from one of our alums, David Caputo, 65 Miami alum. He was asking about the AP, about your process of fact checking. It sounds like it's more systematic through all the writers and journalists, as opposed to like a team of fact checkers that checks every reporter's report or story. Is that right? It's just more systematic?
That's exactly right. I think we have found that it's really every reporter's job to be a fact checker, that we shouldn't be putting out any wrong, we shouldn't be publishing anything that's wrong in a story. And if we have to quote a politician, for example, with information that's inaccurate, tell the reader that it's wrong and why. And so there are some cases where we've had to use a quote from a politician because it's so explosive or newsworthy, with incorrect information. And again, we address that immediately in the story. Or maybe we don't know if what they said is untrue. In those cases, we try to say politician X made an unfounded claim. We couldn't verify it as immediately. Here's the steps we're taking in order to verify it. So really showing your work has become an important element into kind of combating the misinformation that we're seeing spread.
So here's another one, and I think this is a pretty deep question. It could get into theories of psychology and how we think about information out there. But from Stephen, he asks about how do we keep citizens engaged, and so especially thinking about the 20-somethings out there and how important their engagement is for the future of our democracy and hearing their voice. But do you think So number one, how do we keep citizens engaged? But number two, do you think kind of, you raised the issue about, um, fact checking is not all that popular with the public. Do you think that's part of the engagement issue? And so, people are, they want to be engaged because of the misinformation. I mean, it's almost a circular kind of argument. So can you give us some insight on any of that?
Well, if I had a great answer, I think I'd be like a bazillionaire. But I will say, I think there are some adjustments that as a news industry, I've seen a lot of outlets trying to do. And again, it goes back to the kind of showing your work, right? So, how do we take a reader or a viewer kind of through our process to explain this is how we arrived at this conclusion instead of just assuming that they trust us or they trust what we're writing, really explaining, okay, for example, we now have articles that explain why we made a call around an election, like why we decided that we had enough in order to make the call that someone had won, for example. We didn't used to do that. We used to say the AP has called the race and then it was over. Yeah, now we're explaining here's how we count, here's how we do these things, here's how we arrive at that conclusion. And I think that's one way that we keep people engaged is to really take them through the process with us.
Yeah, yeah. And kind of along those lines, we have another one of our listeners asking about um, particular sources for reliable news, sources for reliable information as we think about, the 2024 election season. So can you give our listeners maybe some tips for those sources that they can consider?
Well, obviously the Associated Press. You have Reuters too, another really reputable news agency. Your local newspaper. Continue to read them. Your TV stations. And I want to be clear. We all make mistakes. We all make errors sometimes in our reporting. The difference that you'll notice in a reputable news outlet is they correct those mistakes, right? They put out a correction that says we screwed up and here's why. You won't see that as often from some of these kind of questionable news outlets. And the other thing I would mention too is when you're consuming content on social media platforms, maybe from, again, like a TikTok video or personality, keep in mind that some of their content they might be reading directly off of your local newspaper, a TV broadcast, the AP's website. So that's another kind of conundrum that we run into is people are turning away from traditional news sources, but then they might they might be going actually consuming our content in another way.
Right, right. I think we have at least one more that I see here from our viewers. And you touched on this a little bit, I think, at the beginning, but Linda asks, how do we call out others when we recognize spin without alienating them? So, whether it's Facebook posts or, social media postings that we do or that we see, how do we call out people? How do we approach that issue?
Yeah, I think that's a really tricky one. And again, one I don't have a super great answer for, but I think what's helpful is to really show the person empathy. Like, no one likes to be told, like, you're wrong. So if it's someone that's really near and dear to you, really try to understand and ask questions and maybe listen to them a little. Also, ask yourself, are you the right person to be addressing this with them? Like, if you're really genuinely concerned that someone has gone really down the rabbit hole, but you have this history of going back and forth with them, maybe about politics, you might not be the best person to approach them with your concerns. Not saying that they should stay consumed in this rabbit hole, but just, consider that. I kind of would approach it like any addiction, really. Like you want to listen and be there for the person because they're going to only listen to you if you listen to them. Don't approach it like, hey, I saw on Facebook that you claimed this, but I read XYZ and that's wrong. It's not going to go over well. Try not to publicly call them out either. Again, just come at it with genuine concern for the person.
Okay. All right. Well, very good. I think that gets us through all of our questions that we have, Amanda. So I want to thank you again, Amanda. So Amanda Seitz is with us. Thank you so much, Amanda, for your time and your insights and your expertise that you've shared with our alums today in joining us. And I want to remind our viewers out there just quickly, our next webinar in the 2024 elections will be with Tyler Sinclair on April 16th at 6 p.m. You can watch that event live in Shriver's Heritage Room. If you're local, you can obviously come in person to see Tyler's talk, but you can register just like you've registered for Amanda's session today and for our earlier sessions on the 2024 election. So I want to remind folks about that. And I also wanted to remind folks on June 8th, that Alumni Weekend in Political Science, will be having a gathering at 2 p.m. Right outside of Harrison Hall. And I'm looking forward to seeing you and meeting more of you this summer. So with that, thanks again, Amanda. And until next time, love and honor.